very mindful of everyone's time. So I'm actually very glad to be having Deepak Anand in today's session. It's the first webinar of 2026 of Canna Monitor. We have the plan to conduct a lot more of this year because we have had great feedback actually. And it's very, very exciting to start the year with this very relevant discussion for operators, policymakers, and all the stakeholders in the medical cannabis game, in which we are going to first review all the 2025 data, the most updated official data for the main import markets, and also discuss some of the trends that we have seen over the last quarters and that we expect in the coming months. And having Deepak Anand for this discussion is a great pleasure because he's based in Vancouver, Canada. He has been working in the cannabis space for many, many years. And actually, he has been involved in some of the largest deals, medical cannabis deals internationally. He's still doing that. I think there's very few people that travel more than him to different countries in the world, always with an acute commercial mindset. So it's a pleasure having you here, Deepak. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks, Arnau. Really appreciate you setting this up. Definitely, Canna Monitor continues to be one of my leading kind of choices when I look at market data. So thank you for putting this together and also for all of your insights that you regularly put together. I think I read your newsletter probably more than any other newsletter in the cannabis industry. So thanks again also for all of the work that you do, and very much looking forward to this presentation and conversation.
Really appreciate it, Deepak. And of course, I am the CEO, the founder of Canna Monitor. We deliver a lot of intelligence on the global stage with sometimes it's not always aggregated. And I think today's presentation will really show what we do with the official data. This is data that has been published by the regulators of the different countries. But of course, when you aggregate it and when you also integrate it with market insights, you can get even deeper insights. So you can also subscribe to our platform where our subscribers can access a lot of these insights in the same place. But anyway, because I want to be very mindful of everyone's times, and we have just 1 hour for this webinar and so many topics to discuss. I'm gonna get right in and discuss a little bit of the structure of the webinar. So we are going to focus for the most part on the flower trade. It's true that the extract market is starting to show some signs that there's some interesting developments as well on the extract market, but let's say the information that has been made available by the regulators is mostly on flower, and we're going to focus for the most part on the top 4 markets that still represent over 80% of international trade in medical cannabis, which are, of course, in this order, Germany, which this year is likely to come close to 200 tons in imports, a little bit less, which means that is easily half or close, even more than half of the international market for medical cannabis in 2025. We're also going to cover Australia, which is a second clear contender and also very mature and interesting market. We're going to cover some smaller markets as well, like Israel, the UK, Poland, New Zealand. And we're going to finish with a perspective on the export markets as well, like who is supplying these burgeoning medical cannabis markets internationally. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. We expect that this is going to be dynamic. So please do not hesitate to add your questions on the chat, and then we can answer them at the end. We're going to make sure to have some 10 minutes at least for questions at the end. I don't know, Deepak, if you have any topics that you want to discuss before moving right into the discussion.
Yeah, no, Arno, I think you raised really good points. I think that, for anyone looking at this from a macro level, I think it's really interesting to see what's happening, right? Well, you correctly said the focus of this webinar is mainly on flower. I think, you'll see through the data and analysis, it's really interesting what's happening on the extract side. And I think Australia is really, really leading that side of things, right? With respect to the data in terms of what we call 2.0 products, whether it be, vapes, or whether it be extracts, or even, pastilles or gummies as their terms. So very much looking forward to kind of diving into some of these topics. But I think at a high level, I think Australia is really starting to now show the way with respect to where extracts are going. And so look forward to jumping into that and getting into the discussion.
Appreciate it, Deepak. So let's go into the first slide of let's go into the nitty-gritty. This is the aggregate import figures for the top 4 markets internationally over the last 7 years or something. And the first thing that comes to mind, I would say, when looking at this graph, is what every investor wants to see, which is the nice hockey stick. And Deepak is based in Canada, so it's very it's good to see it. So we see that over the last year, 2024 and 2025 has really seen significant momentum in the market. We have been talking about the possibility of export markets for many, many years. I remember when I started in the industry in 2018, it was already discussed, the potential of Germany, the potential of Australia, and even other markets. But it hasn't been until 2024 and 2025 that we have really seen a big increase in the traded volumes internationally. And this has been due, of course, to regulatory developments, and in particular, I would say, as it's apparent in the yellow segment of the graph, because of German legalization in April 2024, which of course brought an amazing development of the market. We can see from 30 tons in 2023 to this year, probably close to 200 tons in the German market. We see that Germany this year is likely to represent over half of the volume in these 4 markets. It's true that if we include some processing markets, let's say like Portugal, or even if we were to include the extract markets that are significant, like Deepak was mentioning, Australia, but also, for instance, Brazil, particularly for the CBD extracts and increasingly also THC extracts. We see that Germany, in either case, is north of half of traded volumes internationally, which this year are north of 350 tons, probably. However, I would like to also add some precautions to this data, which is that, of course, when we account for the imports, the same product could be imported 2 times. And actually, it's something that we are seeing that, for instance, the UK and Germany, which are the 2 dominant markets in Europe, they also trade with each other. So some products might be double counted. It's something that's relevant for market sizing purposes. But in any case, in 2025, we saw the medical cannabis market jump the 400 tons. This includes both imported products traded internationally, as well as local production that also goes into these mass demand markets, which is particularly relevant for some markets like Australia and Israel, which are also supplied with a lot of their own domestic production. Whereas in other markets like Germany and the UK, it's true that some players are starting to ramp up production as well, but these markets are still 80% plus or even more supplied internationally, and therefore generate interesting opportunities for global producers. I don't know, Deepak, if what I just mentioned more or less fits with your perspective in the market for 2025, or how would you, let's say, if you had to assess 2025 in the context of the last years, what do you think 2025 represented for the international landscape?
Yeah, no, I think, the data speaks for itself in many ways. And, it's great to have that slide that you just kind of pulled up. But I think, just to step it back, maybe one more step, people often criticize Canada, and there's many things to be criticizing about Canada and sort of the approach that we have taken. But I think in many ways, it really shows to you, the perfect kind of learning platform, right? In terms of what is working, what didn't work. You look at the medical market in Germany, you look at the questions that are now being asked with respect to the existing challenges in the market by the new government. These are all things that, we've kind of seen in Canada, right? We saw early on, prior to legalization for non-medical purposes or adult use, that we had a medical market that really represented, the way Germany is going right now, right? So you had our medical market where you basically were able to get, prescriptions through telemedicine. You were able to go and walk into your doctor and get access. So I think, in every single instance, when you look at an issue that may be occurring, whether it be on the telemedicine side, whether it be on the adult use side, Canada, really provides an excellent opportunity and a case study to be looked at. And whilst there are a number of things that pose challenges from a Canadian standpoint with respect to the way that our legalization has unfolded, there is a lot and a tremendous amount of positives as well as benefits, right? And I think one of the big things that you see is the export opportunity, right? Canada still continues to dominate exports, and I know we'll get into this a little bit later, Arnaud, but and we'll certainly talk about things like places like Thailand and places like Colombia. But when you look at this strictly from a supply chain perspective, Canada still continues to dominate, from a supply side. Is there competition? Are markets like South Africa, Colombia, Thailand coming on? Absolutely. Are there reasons to be cautious and concerned? If you're a Canadian cultivator, yes, you definitely need to look at that. But still, we continue to lead from a Canadian standpoint with respect to the amount of products being exported into the international markets, and in particular flower. But again, no surprise, I think the data is here. Germany continues to really dominate the global landscape, and Australia not far behind. So I think this data is great. What I would love to focus on, and we'll get to this maybe a little bit later also, is where are the opportunities in 2026, right? Because I think that you look at the UK, you look at Poland, and we'll get into this. I think those are really interesting markets that are arising and coming on board. And I think if you're a cultivator and you are currently looking at this, and it doesn't really matter where you're based, I think you need to look at some of the emerging markets as much as you may want to focus on just the German market, because there is a lot of SKUs already in the German market with respect to products. But markets like the UK and Poland may not be as deeply kind of penetrated.
Okay, very pertinent comments, Deepak. I would say, well, two things on the Canadian dominance. Let's say the raw figure that we got from the regulators that have released the data is that 60% of the imported products internationally come from Canada. But of course, this doesn't take into account the triangulation that's happening through Portugal, and also increasingly, particularly in the second half of last year, started also to happen a lot with Malta, Czechia, Switzerland, etc. So I estimate that the share of Canadian products that are traded internationally is slightly higher, and probably even including the domestic production in countries like Israel and Australia. Canada still represents easily 2/3 of global supply, let's say. And another thing that's very interesting, like you said, is that, of course, it's a super dynamic landscape. It seems that everything is changing all the time. So when I was looking at the data for 2025, it was very surprising in a way to see that the trends at the beginning of the year are differing also from the trends at the end of the year. There's been a lot of things going on. We had some bottlenecks. We had some INCB quota changes in Australia and in Germany. So it's you definitely need to be very, very tuned in the market to see these changes.
Yeah, and also, Arnaud, just furthering that point with respect to changes and being a dynamic landscape, the other piece that you see also is on the GMP side, right? I think that conversion has been quite popular so far in international markets. We see at least some markets like Germany starting to look at that a little bit more in detail, right? And are asking a lot of detailed questions around what exactly are processing activities, where are they happening, even getting into really great detail around things like drying, as an example. What is the percentage of LOD that you're sending the product through? What is the processor then doing on their side, and kind of looking at that whole supply chain. So I think that this market is, from a regulatory risk perspective, sure, there's the element of what's going to happen in Germany with respect to the political landscape, but then there's also a regulatory question that is starting to occur, at least from what I'm seeing in Germany, with respect to, the GMP questions and the pathways. So, I think that if there's one thing, at least from a German standpoint, I think you will see a bit more regulatory uncertainty on the GMP side. And I think that companies that are already GMP or EU-GMP certified certainly have a significant advantage, at least for the German market in going into 2026.
Amazing, Deepak. So actually, if you're fine with it, let's go into German market insights.
Sure.
We need to mention that the data for the German market is only up to Q3 2025. We don't have the data for the last quarter. We are lucky enough to have Deepak, which has been very involved in some of the movements in Q4, so maybe we can get his sentiment as well. But what I would say, of course, from the 72 tons that were imported in Germany in 2024 to at least 142 that were imported in the first 3 quarters of the year, I would say the main change in terms of the origins of the products is this rise of intermediate processors that happened particularly in the first half of the year. This is the case if we look at the pie charts on the right side of the slide. We see that Portugal has been increasing its share in the German market over the last let's say couple of years. If I'm not wrong, it was only about 15 tons in not even that. 17 tons in 2024, and we are looking that in 2025 it's likely going to be north of 50 tons, even though, as many people are aware, some regulatory developments in Portugal in mid-2025 put a lot of strain into that supply engine that was supplying, for the most part, the German market, because unlike other countries in Europe that have a little bit of a more diversified export base, Portugal has been very much 90% of their exports have been targeted for the German market. We had some license suspensions of important players in Portugal. We had north of 10 tons stuck in warehouses in Portugal. We had some tightening up of the conditions and the paperwork to get export licenses in Portugal, and this put a little bit of strain on the market that even in the Q3 data perhaps was already starting to show, for instance, with the emergence of alternative processors like Malta, for instance, with if I'm not wrong, over 1 ton in exports in Q3 coming from almost nothing. And also, even though it's still not registering a lot in the data, we know that, for instance, in Czech Republic, Switzerland, etc., there's been many of these players that have the advantage, particularly of being in the European Union, therefore being able to batch release the products that have been targeting not only their own production for export to Germany, but also importing for processing and then re-exporting to the market. In Q4, what I would expect is, well, first, a little bit of a slowdown in the massive increase in the import rate. Q3 was north of 50 tons, if I'm not wrong now. So I wouldn't expect Q4 to follow this such a fast growth because of what Deepak was mentioning before. There's some saturation is starting to become apparent in the market, and this is also impacting, for instance, the product pricing. One might say bottlenecks are going to impact prices. You know, if supply is reduced, it's likely that prices are going to increase a little bit, and this might be true on paper, but actually in the medical cannabis space, we have a perishable product. So if you have had a lot of products in the inventories for a long time, maybe the effect is the opposite. You want to sell it fast, and therefore you want to sell it cheaply. So this has also put perhaps some downward pressure on both wholesale and retail prices in the German market, also mimicking some of the trends that we saw in the Canadian market, like Deepak was mentioning. So, for instance, I would say further stratification of by price and quality. So the premium products have been able to hold their margins to a higher degree, and we see that let's say the maximum prices in the market are not falling as much as the minimum or the average, no? But we see a lot of downward pressure, particularly in the lowest priced segment of the market, which has been dragging the average prices down. And then this has also translated during 2025 in many of the distributors launching their own budget brands to target these specific segments of customers. And yeah, I don't know, Deepak, do you see it similarly, or do you have a different insight? And also, what's your sentiment for Q4? We are estimating, if we just divided the first 3 quarters by 3 and multiplied by 4, so it would be 47 tons. It's probably going to be a little bit more, I'm assuming, but there's also the quota situation that came about in Q4. So yeah, Deepak, 2 questions. What do you think happened in Q4, and your sentiment for 2026? And what are some trends that you think are driving the market right now?
Yeah, so I'd say, definitely now from my perspective, I'd like to step it back and just bring it back to, the complexity of supply chains, right? I think that really at a very high level, I think people estimate sort of the value of, a detailed kind of supply chain, right? And actually understanding what it takes. And what I mean by that is, Portugal is a classical example of, when a challenge happens in a supply chain, it has a pretty significant disruption event, right? It has an effect on price. It also has an impact on product movement, right? So I think that I cannot sort of underscore the importance of supply chain. And I think that, and that really brings it back to EU-GMP certification. So, I think if you are in Canada or in Thailand or in Colombia or in Australia, wherever you might be, I think, having GMP or EU-GMP equivalent kind of licensing, there is no replacement to that. Right. I think that often there is this misnomer that, I'll get GACP and then I'm done and that's it, and I often tell people, GACP is only the starting point, right? It's literally just the first thing in a step in many, many steps with respect to the process, right? So, getting from GACP to GMP is where most people really have a hard time. If you are GMP or EU-GMP certified today, I think there is no replacing that with respect to the robustness that brings you. It gives you not only a higher value in terms of a dollar or price per gram, but it also then takes out all of this complexity in supply chain. And I just want to, zoom in on that because you brought that up with respect to the challenges in Portugal. And I think what that has taught a lot of people is that, and even on the German side or people that are importing really have, they've started to realize that we cannot be dependent on any single company, on B, any single country with respect to where we want to process. Because what we saw in Portugal and are seeing still, it's gotten a lot better now, but what we saw in 2025 in Portugal was just a complete shutdown of the industry for a couple of months with respect to the processing activities, right? And that had a significant impact on supply chains. And what that resulted in is really the companies that are EU-GMP certified or TGA-GMP certified to get an opportunity then to be able to go directly into Germany as an example and make sure that, they were able to seize opportunity. The other thing you talked about was saturation. And I think that's a really interesting point because yes, there is a lot of concern and hesitation on behalf of German players with respect to what they are currently doing and where the regulations will currently go, and that's certainly impacting their forecasting and how many orders they might want to place. I think that certainly is an element there. But we are seeing, we're still seeing a lot of movement, and I think the movement is more so in the value kind of mainstream category, right? I think where you're seeing a lot of the saturation, the compression, all of that stuff is a little bit more on the craft kind of higher end segment of the market. Whereas on the value side, I don't think you're seeing the same level of saturation. Absolutely, I agree with you. Is Q1 going to look the same as Q4? Probably not. I think, you will see a little bit of a softer movement, but still, you're still seeing a lot of velocity. I'm still seeing a lot of velocity with respect to, companies in Germany that now have strains that are stable in the market. Flow's just recently released a top 10 strain report, and, we can argue whether, that's perfect or not. I think it certainly is in the right direction. It certainly shows the sentiment of the market in terms of where and what is moving. And I think that is indicative of what I'm saying is that there still is demand for certain strains. I think the challenge that faces the industry still is that consistent, reliable supply of strains, right? It's great to be able to get a particular drop or get product that's just basically picked up and that's different month to month. But I think there is that real core need for a sustainable product on a long-term basis, and then that's where the quality aspect comes in. That's where the volume game comes in. So I think companies that understand that aspect in terms of how important it is to have a stable strain, combined with the licensing aspect and understanding, having EU-GMP, that's where you've really got a win-win situation. I think if you're GACP and you're still routing, it doesn't really matter if you're routing to Portugal or Czech Republic. I look at that still as a risk. Probably one country is a lower risk than another. Malta certainly seems to be coming up, but it's not like any of those countries have it sorted out. So it's not like moving AFA from Portugal into Czech or Malta is the sort of the magic bullet, because there just isn't one, right? And I think that the magic bullet is EU-GMP, and I think that's what really keeps you in the game. I'm still very, very optimistic. I know we want to get off Germany and move on to some other markets, but I'm still very optimistic and bullish on the German market. I still think there is tremendous opportunity. Regardless of what happens on telemedicine, and we saw Poland go through a very similar discussion around telemedicine and kind of make changes. And when that year had a drop off, but it's not like it didn't come back then, right? So certainly it's not the end of the world, even if there are a few changes on the regulatory side in Germany.
Absolutely.
But I do think that the GMP supply chain piece is probably the most critical thing for both suppliers and buyers to really sort out on both sides.
Very interesting, Deepak. And just because you're right, we need to move to other countries, but just to mention that all the pressure on the reform of the MedCanG, it seems, at least over the recent weeks, that the CDU, which is the ruling party right now in Germany, is, let's say, easing their tough stance on the MedCanG reform. It looks like maybe the mail order ban is gonna be dropped, and perhaps the prescription reform, it's probably going to be tightened somehow, but perhaps not the worst scenarios that we were thinking about a few months ago. So actually, let me move forward to the Australian market. Sadly, the ODC, which is one of Australia's regulators, doesn't publish the last year's import data until August or September each year. It's a massive delay, so we still don't know how much medical cannabis flower was imported into the market. However, we know it's still, of course, the second largest market in terms of import in the world. And we also know the INCB quota, which was actually reduced in a move that also fits this trend that we were mentioning of regulatory tightening in a few of these markets that have been very much driven by telemedicine. This hasn't escaped the Australian market, and also the concerns about getting too many import permits, etc., have also driven this restriction of the quota, which was set, if I'm not wrong, at 101 tons, and it was then reduced to 88 tons. It seems likely that the figure would be not much smaller than in 2024, so likely 80 tons or something like that in imports. However, I'm still guessing a little bit. It's true, like I was mentioning before, that the Australian market has a lot of domestic production, and also some of these producers were also pressuring to get some restrictions on the imports, which, unlike what we were seeing before with Germany, that is let's say a very diverse landscape in terms of import. In the case of Australia, has been pretty much dominated. 4 out of 5 imports were of Canadian products, and even in the data for 2024, funnily enough, we don't see a lot of the new entrants showing up, apart from South Africa, which is true that we know that both on the flower and the extracts, there's been an increasing influx of products from South Africa, but particularly, I would say, 2025 in Australia, and perhaps even globally, one of the trends that we could save for the history books is the entry of Thai products, which has been discussed for a long time. But it wasn't until 2025 that many of these producers in Thailand were ready for exportation. This has also come during when the Thai government, which is now led by the cannabis czar of or at least the promoter of legalization in the country. The government has restricted the market back to medical. Apparently, the reality on the ground is perhaps more complex than that, but at least it has granted some legitimacy to the exports, and this has also helped, for instance, the potential entry of Thai products directly into the German market, which was something that wasn't possible until very recently. And also we are starting to see Thai products appearing not only in Australia, which has been happening since, I would say, beginning of 2025, but also now they are starting to arrive in the UK, in Germany, etc. And also, I need to mention that as well, of course, out of the four dominant markets for medical cannabis internationally, Australia is the one that has a more diverse product mix, let's say. So even though flower is still the dominant format, and in terms of items, it was still north of 70% of items dispensed in the latest data that we have available. However, we are seeing the very interesting rise of, for instance, pastille edibles in the market, also the vapes, which are sometimes in the new authorizations for patients. They are north of 20% of new authorizations are for these novel product formats, which is also bringing a lot of innovation. I would say also the concentrates. They also have a very conducive regulatory framework allowing the introduction of new product formats, which definitely helps in creating a thriving market. So Deepak, what's your sentiment for? Well, I know you're going to be in Australia very, very soon, if I'm not wrong, in 1 month, because of United in Compassion, very interesting event down there. So what are you looking forward to in Australia? What do you think of the Thai situation? And yeah, what's your sentiment for 2026 in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, Arnau, Australia on the one hand really shows, and I think your graphs there really show what happens when a market allows for a variety of form factors of products to come in, right? And also shows what happens when you allow products to come in from places like South Africa, that do have a mutual recognition agreement on GMP, and therefore are able to get products in very quickly versus a market like Canada as an example. On the other hand, I will caution, again, we are seeing a lot of growth in Australia. We have certainly seen a lot of Thai products making it into that market. But, Australia has a consultation currently ongoing with respect to where they want medical cannabis to go. And I think if you read that consultation, there are a number of things to be concerned about in terms of where the government is looking to go on this, right? So, it's still very early days in the global cannabis market. I do think that Australia will start to tighten up on certain things. I certainly can speak from a GMP standpoint with respect to all of the products that are getting into the Australian market, including from Canada. Are they of the same standard as it would hold to the UK or a German regulator? Probably not, right? And I think that just speaks to, on the one side, the robustness of the European, UK kind of, regulatory landscape versus the relative openness of the Australian GMP landscape. It does open up a number of opportunities for sure, and we're certainly seeing companies in Canada take advantage of that regulatory opportunity. But I do, caution that because I do see that as a bit of a flag. But that being said, it's really interesting because they are all of these formats that are permitted into the market. I think, again, if I bring this back, what does it mean if I'm a manufacturer of either 2.0 products like gummies or vapes or even flower? I certainly see Australia as being, one of those markets where if you're sitting in Canada and you're a Canadian operator, unless you've got really, really high quality extracts, vapes, edibles, which certainly have a space and a price premium, I think you're going to see a lot of competition from places like South Africa and Thailand, as you are already seeing on the flower piece, right? And I think at some point it does become challenging for the Canadian operators or even other operators around the globe to start to compete with Thailand, right? So I think that is playing out live in front of our eyes in Australia. Will it directly translate into Germany? I don't think so. I think that, the supply chain is a lot more complex. And I think this is why I really urge people that are looking at different markets to not take a one-size-fits-all approach, because it is absolutely not the case. So just because something is working in Australia doesn't mean that when Germany starts to liberalize vapes, that, I'm going to then flood the German market with the same products that I'm selling into Australia, because that's been the approach so far. This is very much not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not the same measure through which, the German regulators are going to look at these types of products. And, I think that there is some still regulatory uncertainty with respect to Australia. And this year we'll see where the Australian kind of consultation goes. But I think that, all of these things are important to kind of keep in mind. It's still very, very early days in cannabis. So, to be able to place bets on saying that, these product formats or these markets are going to be a given is not really the case. I think you will see more competition from different places. So, that's my very high level kind of thoughts. Am I concerned that Thailand is probably going to definitely beat Canada as it relates to the Australian market in 2026? Yes, I think when we look at this graph now that you have here in Canada is that 62 kind of percent of the Australian market, what does that look like in 25 and 26? I think that number goes down quite significantly. The same graph in Germany, does it go down to the same extent? I don't think so. I still think, yes, will you start to see Thailand come on as a blip on that chart? Yes. Are we going to see this chart in Australia have Thailand start to take a more dominant role? I also think so. So it's just important to, kind of mention that. But Australia really is a really interesting market to look at when you look at, particularly the new formats of products.
Brilliant insights, Deepak. I might also add the incipient consolidation in the Australian market, I would say, with some relevant M&A deals both last year and this year. It looks like it's continuing with the proposed Canatrek by LGP acquisition. We've seen some of these moves in Germany last year. It's not an M&A webinar, but I believe it's relevant because it has been framed, these acquisitions in Germany, in terms of also supply chain implications. So do you think something similar to that might be relevant also for Australia? We are seeing some, the goal of some of these acquisitions is also, admittedly, to have a better entry into the European Union markets, for instance. So how do you think this plays out in the supply chain, this consolidation and these moves between distributors and producers and so on?
Yeah, I mean, look, Little Green Pharma and Canatrek were not the only kind of big M&A opportunity in the last year. I think Phytoka had a pretty sizable investment that they got in from a group in China. So it's, M&A is, not necessarily the right term. I think there is a lot of interest now in, what's happening in Australia and some of the Australian companies outside of LGP, Canatrek, and kind of, as I mentioned, Phytoka. And there's, I think there will be more examples. And again, I triangulate everything back to Canada, right? We saw this early days. We saw a lot of M&A between, sizable players in the market here. And I think there is something to be said with respect to at least a couple of these companies in Australia that have figured out both the domestic landscape as well as the international landscape. I think the Little Green Pharma is really interesting because they also then offer the Danish kind of opportunity as well, and they have boots on the ground in Germany. So I think they are a perfect example of a company that is not in Canada, that's not Canadian based, but has a big presence outside of even their home market, which is Australia. Whereas we saw the same thing happen. You saw Tilray, you saw Canopy Growth, you saw a variety of companies from Canada, go into Europe and try and seize that opportunity. It worked for some, it didn't work for others. It's, arguably not playing out as well for a couple of them, but you are starting to see some of the Australian players kind of get to that same stage and saying, we also have the right to compete. And I think that investors are definitely interested in looking at, what can Australian companies offer? And I think that's why you saw the Phytoka sizable investment, in my opinion, from a Chinese group as well.
Okay, very interesting, Deepak. So let's move into our next market, which is the Israeli market. They've done some changes in the reporting over the last few years, which is why we don't have the breakdown by countries in the last couple of years. However, I would assume that it's not super different compared to the previous ones, in the sense that Canadian dominance. It's true that a big development that started in 2023 and has only been finished recently, a couple of weeks ago, was the investigation into the dumping, alleged dumping by Canadian companies, which already pointed that very few companies were actually very active in the Israeli market, bringing a lot of products in bulk. A couple in particular, some of the, and actually a couple of weeks ago, an Israeli court finally determined that no import tariff would be imposed on Canadian products. Of course, that investigation had a lot of flaws in terms of how the prices, import prices, production prices, margins, etc., were calculated. So it seems that we have returned to to a free market concept, which is good for trade, of course. But I would say that even beyond the regulatory topics, something relevant in this regard is the change in the positioning of Israel in the supply chain, in the sense that it was at the beginning, well, before 2019, like we see in the chart, there were no imports, they weren't allowed, so it was entirely supplied by some of their producers, which they have had like for over 20 years, like Tikkun Olam, for instance. And then as they opened the market to importers, we saw that particularly on the highest price segment, the more premium indoor products were increasingly, the more sought after products as well, were increasingly being brought over from Canada and also other areas. It was also one of the first targets of the GMP washing dynamics. So for instance, some of the 2020 products from Portugal, we know that were actually coming from other jurisdictions, like Uruguay, for instance. However, I would say the producers that were very much adamant in terms of let's please introduce some tariff to protect our domestic industry from cheap imports. Let's say this has been overcome by greater operational prowess, and we are seeing that the latest data that we have is that over 7 tons were exported from Israel in 2025 up to September. So it's likely, because it was also escalating towards the end of the year, it seems very likely that it's going to be north of 10 tons exported from Israel in 2025, which compared to the 30 tons that were imported already paints a different picture than what we had in 2022 or in 2023, when there was a certain collapse of the import market due to saturation. We had 100 tons of unsold inventory. Let's take into account that the production in Israel is also north of 70 tons, something like that. So there was an abundance of supply. Over the last few months, let's say the cycle has been playing out. Now we are seeing, for instance, some higher price launches into the Israeli market. We are seeing more premium, both domestic and imported products getting into the market. So it's a completely new dynamic, I would say, for Israeli producers in particular, even though let's say the number of companies in financial distress hasn't been there's been some new companies that have entered bankruptcy proceedings and the likes of, well, I'm not going to mention, but anyway, it's a very dynamic situation, I would say, in the Israeli market. Do you have any insights, Deepak, on Israel in this regard?
Yeah, look, I think Arnau, it continues to be an interesting market. I think what you talked about with respect to the tariffs, even though that's now gone away, I think, generally tariffs are a hot topic at the moment across the globe. And I think that it does raise questions, particularly on markets like Canada, in terms of, are we able to continue to hold our position? I can't imagine someone would want to import, or export cannabis into Canada, given how much product we have here, the quality, etc. But it still does open notionally the question on can Canadian, or the government of Canada more specifically, continue to not, through policy, permit imports into the country, right? I think it does open up that question, and I know that has been asked by other jurisdictions beyond Israel, but it does open up that question generally with respect to trade and in particular free trade. But yeah, I mean, Israel continues to be, an interesting market. I think that there are still, people selling into that market. I still think there is an opportunity to be able to get products there. Obviously, they have their own nuances with respect to coverage and with respect to, the types of products and the potency limits that can be sold into that market. So there are restrictions around that, but it still continues to be a really interesting market. It has cooled off somewhat, but still continues to be an interesting market.
Absolutely. I would just mention, in terms of the demand trends in the Israeli market, for a while we had a lot of headlines mentioning the drop in patients in the market, and this was somewhat artificial artifact, partially, not entirely, due to the fact that the reform switching from, let's say, patient authorizations to prescriptions, reduced the number of licensed patients, but actually a fraction of the patients were accessing case-by-case prescriptions in some cases. So it's true that the market has cooled off, but not as much as some people would have thought. we are talking 7-8 million people, and it's still the third market internationally, with easily north of 50 tons of annual demand. So it's still a really relevant market. Let's move on though to the UK, which I think, Deepak, you mentioned before, you have a lot of expectations for this market in 2026. We have been talking about the UK also for a long time, since, if I'm not wrong, it was 2018 when they passed the reform, thanks to some very courageous mothers. And the market has been very slow to pick up, of course, because of no public support for the for prescriptions in the NHS. However, the development of the private clinic sector has been very exciting, and we can see it also that the market is starting to gain some momentum. The data that we are showing here is only reflects up to August of 2025. So with about 13 tons imported, then we do the projection based on the same trend, and it would come up to 21 tons for the full of 2025. And also something very interesting, I would say, in the case of the UK compared to other global jurisdictions, and also in the case of Canada, is the fact that it has been, for the most part, anchored in a European supply chain. We see that in 2023, 50% of the imports came from Spain. We kind of monitor in our report that we published a couple of years ago. We're the first to deliver this data based on prescription level data. And also Portugal, Macedonia, etc., were some, or at the beginning, even the Netherlands were important jurisdictions in supplying the UK. I would say in the case of Spain, this is mostly due to very specific factors by some actors in particular, like Curaleaf having a facility in Spain that they can reroute product from Portugal, etc. And also some of the largest grower in Spain, like Linneo, selling a lot into the British market. We are seeing that the trend of new SKUs launches in the market has been increasing throughout 2024 and 2025, and we are seeing that Canadians started paying attention, perhaps over the last year, a little bit more into the Canadian market. So we are seeing a lot of these more premium indoor products being launched into the market. Also, something interesting, perhaps because of the smaller and let's say more private clinic, patient-driven market, in a way, perhaps we have the UK market has managed to sustain a little bit of higher prices without seeing too much of the saturation that has started to plague the German and even earlier the Australian market. So margins are still somewhat healthy, but of course, like in any market, this attracts new entries. And this is perhaps what's going to bring further saturation later on. What do you think, Deepak? What are you expecting on the UK this year?
Yeah, I'd say, Arnau, this graph is good, but also it doesn't tell the whole story, right? I think there are very specific form factors that result in some of the higher numbers in some of these graphs, right? Where, for example, you look at Macedonia as an example, and the reason that it really registers on here is because, there's one particular segment, at least, of extracts that seems to be really have come, at least in past, up to August of 2025 through Macedonia. Yes, there is some flower coming in as well, but it's skewed based on sort of the different product types. I think that generally, I think you hit the nail on the head, Arnau, with respect to the price compression that you're seeing in markets like Germany, the saturation of SKUs that you're seeing in Germany is not the case in the UK. I certainly think that is much lesser so. I think from a patient lens also, I think that, there are companies, and I certainly know some in Canada, that are bypassing Germany completely and saying, we're going to focus on the UK market. We are going to, have our own brand in the UK market. And I think, the consumer in the UK is really interesting, is really interesting. And the patient in this case, they are paying a lot of interest on, things like terpene profiles, on things like strains, things like quality. They're going to Reddit and actually looking at kind of, what is feedback in Canada, what does that look like, and actually demanding for certain strains to come in. So I think that UK is very much seems to be emerging not only as a higher price per gram, but also is emerging as a bit of a brand play, right? I think that companies that are a bit hesitant to launch their own brands into the German market are feeling a little bit more bullish and optimistic of the UK market because they've got both the price per gram, and then they've got the ability to be able to, sell their products as their own brand and leverage what they've done in places like Canada and put that on the market, or in places like Australia as an example, and put it there. So I think that you will see more higher quality kind of premium brands come into the UK market. I think you are correct. A number of Canadian groups are paying very close attention to the UK market, and so you will expect to see more of those SKUs coming in. Again, the downside, the UK regulatory environment is not for the faint of heart. There are a number of different loopholes that you need to get through. The Home Office, it has their own processes through which they look at imports. There's a number of licensing that you need to make sure that you have. There are certain form factors that are permitted and not permitted. And then there's the element of marketing, right? We saw at least one brand get significantly cracked down on by the UK regulator with respect to, promoting things like in Canada, we have the restrictions on names and affiliations with, celebrities and things of that nature. So, the element that you don't see with respect to enforcement on marketing in Germany, you are seeing already in a market like the UK. So again, I really caveat, people that are looking to get into the UK. Yes, it does provide an opportunity. Yes, you get the higher price per gram. What is the form factor that you're getting into? Are you going to now launch a gummy into the UK market? I can tell you, you will have a number of challenges trying to import that directly into the market, right? Versus getting it made in the UK. So there's a number of regulatory nuances that you need to keep in mind when you look at the UK market. Is it going to grow? Absolutely. Is the growth going to be sustainable? Yes. Is there price compression and saturation? Not yet. So does that present an opportunity? Absolutely. But again, there are some regulatory risks and other elements to keep in mind with respect to the UK market, specifically because I can tell you the Home Office and the MHRA both are paying very close attention to what is happening and what is coming in.
Thank you for the insights, Deepak.
Then there's the cultivation piece as well, as my friend Alfredo just reminded me on the UK, right? I think that is an interesting piece as well. It's not zero. There's obviously the stuff that's happening within the UK itself, outside of GW Pharma. And then there's also the affiliated kind of, Jersey and Guernsey and some of the other territories outside the UK that are also now coming online. And there's, cultivators in those markets that are ramping up and scaling up. So there's some domestic cultivation aspect there as well.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm gonna move very fast actually, because we only have 5 minutes left and we want to get some questions in. So let me just mention that some other markets that we are paying close attention are Poland, which, as we mentioned before, the final data for 2025 in terms of sales shows that the recovery from the telemedicine ban that was enacted at the end of 2024. So we celebrate that. Market close to 5 tons for sellout volumes in the pharmacies. Let's see 2026. There's been some innovation in, let's say, go-to-market and how to get prescriptions and clinical clinical models in Poland. So something exciting. New Zealand, another market that is growing. The last data that we have is from 2023, close to 2 tons. But it's still a growing market. And let's say Brazil, it's not on the same category because its flower is not allowed in the Brazilian market. For now, I've seen some comments saying that Anvisa, either as an intermediate product for further extraction, this is why they introduced it into their monographs, but also as a potentially, again, as a finished dose, could be on the cards in the future. But it's a massive market, of course, 200 million people, over 500,000 patients already in Brazil. I don't know, Deepak, if you want to add something.
I just want to counter on the opposite side, right? Yes, Poland, New Zealand, Brazil provide tremendous opportunities in their own segments. But again, is the Poland price per gram significantly higher even on B2B? Absolutely. Is that because there's very few people in the market? Yes. But it takes a long time for you to get a dossier registered in Poland, as an example, right? I mean, expect to wait 8 to 12 months to be able to get a dossier registered, right? And it's not for the faint of heart. Again, I think you need to have quite a bit of detail with respect to the dossier that you're submitting, and expect a lot of questions from the regulator in Poland. And there's a lot of back and forth that goes in before you can actually get into that market. So the incumbents certainly are definitely provide a great opportunity. And will there be a couple more coming in? Yes. Is it going to be the storm that you see in Germany with respect to a flood in the market? No, I don't think that Poland will see that. Similarly, New Zealand, again, triple bat stability. It's not for the faint of heart, right? So you need to make sure that you have a robust quality regulatory team. It's a small market, yes. Is there a price per gram advantage? Also, yes. But are you going to then be able to is every single cultivator going to be able to get into some of those markets? I don't think so. I don't think it's for everybody. I think it's really important. Again, I think the theme here really is when you look at international cannabis markets, it's not just getting GACP, it's not just getting GMP, it's things like the dossier submission, it's things like the medical device registration if it comes to a vape, it's things like the triple back stability when it comes to New Zealand. So I think these are all really important things to factor in when it comes to looking at some of these markets.
Absolutely. And some markets that haven't developed yet, but might show some potential along these lines. Of course, France, of course, Spain, Ukraine are also exciting. They are, of course, pretty much meaningless still in terms of actual volume of sales or imports, but the potential is there. So something that we'll keep in mind in 2026 for sure. Before going into the Q&A, Deepak, I just wanted to show some of the data that we have gathered on Canadian exports. We have seen an upward trend throughout the year, particularly as shown by the trading customs data that StatsCan publishes. So it seems that the current rate of exports from Canada is about 30 tons, but some players, let's say there's been a lot of entry of a lot of new players that want to export from Canada over the last year, particularly in Germany, but elsewhere. So just quickly, Deepak, what's your sentiment for 2026 on Canadian exports?
Yeah, I think I still remain pretty bullish on Canadian exports. I'm not concerned that, we're going to see a massive decline. Do markets like Australia worry me if I'm a Canadian operator? Yes. Does that mean that I cannot enter the market? No. I think that if I've got a robust product like a vape or a gummy, as an example, that is high quality, maybe live rosin, something that's really interesting, will I still be able to compete despite similar products coming from South Africa? I do think so. If I am just a flower producer and I'm going to be, selling flower into the Australian market, it does concern me. So generally, I'm still very optimistic about Canadian exports. I'm also very optimistic about the Canadian domestic industry. I think we're seeing a real thriving, robust industry. We're starting to see companies emerge in the domestic market that have really now gotten and captured the hearts of both consumers as well as retailers. And so you're really starting to see the true winners in the Canadian market start to emerge. And I think you'll see more of that. And it's not just those Canadian companies that are exporting. I think there's a lot of companies that are purposefully focusing on the domestic market, and that's paying off for them.
Amazing. So I'm glad to see the Canadian market coming out of the glut, let's say. I'm looking now at some of the comments. Actually, I see that we had a thriving comment section during our panel, which is good. It means that our discussion sparked some interest. There's, for instance, Joram confirms that 2024 and 2025, the imports into Israel were a lot from Canada. Stephanie Paul mentions fantastic format. Let's see, Rene from Canada mentions regulatory plus release machine. That's not sustainable. You need EU-style change control, stability, validated processes, recall readiness, pharmacovigilance. So, of course, we are talking medical markets that follow pharmaceutical legislation, not adult use markets. And okay, I'm seeing a first question by Guillem. He mentions which type of stakeholder, what interactions caused you to revise your assumptions on the market in 2025? Okay.
I'm not sure about that question. Sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, no worries. I'm not understanding it either. Yeah. So let me move into another one. Okay, so yeah, in 2025 we saw a few trade shocks, particularly with the bottleneck in Portugal, but also with the quota situation in some of the markets. So in 2026, if we had to have some precaution or something that some trade shock that might emerge, Deepak, what are you, let's say, worried? Are you worried, for instance, about regulatory change for the prescription in places like Germany and Australia? Do you think this is the main risk right now in the international market?
No, I don't think I'm as concerned about, am I looking and am I focusing on some of the changes in Germany? Yes, I definitely keeping my eye on it. Is that a terrible concern? No, will there be some factoring and hedging in there with respect to, some of the plans, some of the products that, and the volume of product that goes out? Yes. I think the bigger concern should be for companies that are non-GMP certified or EU-GMP certified, right? Whether it be EU-GMP in Australia, if they don't have it, or EU-GMP in Canada, if companies that don't have it. I'm a bit more concerned for those companies. I'm in particular concerned about companies that are in the processing business that are sitting outside the EU. So by that, I mean companies in Canada, Switzerland. Am I concerned about them? Yes, because they're technically not within the EU. And I think that there will be more of a crackdown on the processing piece, certainly both with the new kind of GACP guidelines, as well as some of the enforcements that we're seeing in certain German jurisdictions. I think that would probably be my top concern with respect to some of the markets. I think that, again, all of this is hedged by GMP or EU GMP certification. So I think that would probably be my number one concern. To be honest, I would place that even above any domestic in-market changes in Germany, as an example.
Okay, let's try to get a couple more quick questions, quick answers, if you can, Deepak, to be mindful of everyone's time.
Let's take one last question now, because I do have a call that I have to get on to.
Okay, let's do the last one. By Fezri's Money, he's asking, what is the likelihood of the Australian or the EU markets to follow a similar blueprint to Canada and open up a recreational cannabis market in the next 3 to 5 years?
Wow, I mean, Faz, that's definitely a crystal ball type question. Is it likely to happen? Maybe. Trying to kind of bet on when markets will go legal, I think is always a dangerous game, and one that I usually stay away from. Having said that, are you going to see more momentum in markets like Switzerland, where you've got sort of a pilot project that is furthering? I think so. Are you seeing the existing consultation in Switzerland to move towards a recreational market? Yes. So, is Australia going to go legal in the next 3 to 5 years? I'm not entirely sure that I would place bets on that one, but I do see a more opening up of, this trial program type situation like we're seeing in Switzerland. And, that Switzerland is definitely an interesting market that I look at, because they don't sit within the EU. They're part of the European Economic Area, EEA, but they're technically not an EU member state in its true definition. They are part of the Schengen zone, so that provides some complexities. But nonetheless, I do see markets like Switzerland evolving and furthering that adult use type program, right? And I think that is probably something we may see more of in some other jurisdictions.
Absolutely. We already saw some of the first M&A acquisitions in Europe recently. So perhaps there's some potential there. Anyway, we have already gone over the time that we had allocated. I just want to thank everyone for their presence, and particularly Deepak. Thank you very much for sharing all your insights with us. I will make available this presentation to everyone very soon through LinkedIn, and please do not hesitate to ask any questions on the DMs to either Deepak or myself. We had some questions that we couldn't answer. Maybe we'll answer them later in the comments. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone, and give us feedback. Do you want us to do more of these sessions? Have a nice one.
Thanks so much, Arnau. Appreciate the time. Bye-bye.